Testosterone is the most important male sex hormone. Men who are heavily influenced by testosterone are said to be egotistical and they enjoy taking risks. But a number of European scientists have been trying to find out whether testosterone is really as bad as its reputation. We've come to the Münster University Hospital to talk to Dr. Michael Sitzmann, a German specialist in the treatment of diseases that affect men. He's also an expert on hormones.
Testosterone ist zuständig für viele Dinge im
Testosterone
Körper.
is responsible for the development of a number of male physical characteristics, including hair patterns on the head. It also determines beard growth, affects muscles, and a man's overall personality. It's a much more complex hormone than some people might think.
So auf den ersten Blick denken könnte.
Most testosterone is produced in the testes, but a small amount comes from the adrenal cortex. The specific sources of testosterone are the Leydig cells. The hormones that are responsible for developing male characteristics in the body are called androgens. The most important androgen is testosterone. Levels of testosterone rise dramatically during puberty and then remain at a high level. But researchers have also found significant short-term increases in this hormone immediately after birth.
Man ist sich nicht ganz klar, warum das passiert. Es scheint aber
It's hard to say why that happens,
das Gehirn
but it seems to be a part of the maturation process in the brain
und auch, dass die
and in the male reproductive system.
des späteren Mannes überhaupt möglich werden.
Christian Wolf lives in Heilbronn. At the age of 20, he discovered that he had too little testosterone in his body. Doctors later determined that the cells in his brain were not sending out the proper production signals. The cause of the problem wasn't clear. At first, Wolf had a hard time even describing the symptoms. It took a long time for doctors to come up with a proper diagnosis.
Es war ein schleichender Prozess, das Ganze zu merken.
Realizing that something was wrong was a gradual
dass man an einem
process.
Tag merkt, so,
It
ey,
didn't
das war's,
happen
sondern man merkt, so,
overnight.
oh, mir geht's immer schlechter.
I kept feeling worse and worse. I had no energy at all, and no sex drive
An dem
either.
Zeitpunkt selbst merkt man nicht, dass man
But I
keine
could feel
Libido hat,
something just
sondern
wasn't
rückwirkend
right.
fällt einem auf, ach, da hat was gefehlt.
And then I was
Was
diagnosed
man
with
nicht hat,
depression.
merkt man schlecht. Ja, dann kam es irgendwann
And I
dazu,
realized
dass
that
ich
something was
klinisch
seriously
diagnostizierte
wrong with me.
Depressionen hatte, aufgrund von, also ich habe dann irgendwann gemerkt, so, ey, irgendwas stimmt nicht.
Wolf was a medical student at the time and a bodybuilder. He kept a close eye on his metabolism and testosterone levels.
Dann hat man nach den Ursachen gesucht, weil
I couldn't
eigentlich hat so
figure
alles
out what was
gepasst,
going on.
familiär, Freundin,
I
unitechnisch
got
und so
along
war
well with
alles
my
in Ordnung.
family.
Und
and had a
ja,
girlfriend.
dann
I was doing
ging's
well
so,
at school.
dass
And then
ich
I
halt
figured
selbst
out
auf die
that
Idee
this
kam,
might
ach
have
komm,
something
lass
to
doch
do
mal
with a
das testen,
testosterone
also
deficiency.
Testosteronmangel bzw. den Testosteronwert
So I had some
testen
tests
lassen.
done, and the levels turned out to be
da kam eben
about
raus, dass er
zero.
bei knapp 0
That's
ist.
a bit
Und
low.
0 ist ein bisschen zu wenig.
How much testosterone do men actually need?
Im Durchschnitt hat
On
ein
average,
Mann
men have at least 8 to 12 nanomoles per liter of testosterone. Anything below that represents a
damit
deficiency,
keine Symptome
but the amount
des
also depends on
Testosteronmangels
genetics.
hat. Aber es hängt auch ein bisschen von der Genetik.
Women's testosterone
Die
levels
Frau
are
hat
much lower,
ungefähr 5
about
bis
5 to
10%
10% that of
der
men's.
Testosteronspiegel
They use
des
the
Mannes.
testosterone to synthesize
Und aus diesem
estrogen,
Testosteron
the
stellt sich
primary
dann das
female sex
Östrogen her,
hormone.
was für sie ja viel wichtiger ist.
That synthesis is carried out by an enzyme called aromatase. It can be found in cells in several parts of the body, including the brain, adrenal glands, ovaries and testes. In the face of such testosterone levels, Christian Wolf chose a potentially risky form of medical treatment.
Wusste ich halt, okay, ich muss halt auf eine
I knew I
Testosteronersatztherapie,
needed
nachdem
hormone
alle anderen
replacement therapy
ja,
after
nennen wir es
other
mal
possible causes,
Lifestyle-Faktoren,
like
Lebensfaktoren
vitamin D or
ausgeschlossen wurden,
zinc
sowas wie
deficiency
Schlafmangel,
have been
Vitamin
ruled
D-Mangel,
out.
Zinkmangel und so weiter, wurde alles ausgeschlossen.
One of the side effects of hormone replacement therapy is that it suppresses sperm production, which can cause infertility.
Die Frage ist immer, wie wird Testosteron im Körper überhaupt
Testosterone is
hergestellt?
naturally produced in the testicles, but the
Das
process begins in
Testosteron
the
wird
brain.
natürlich im Hoden hergestellt,
specifically
aber
in the
tut das nicht von
hypothalamus.
allein. Es gibt eine zentrale Steuereinheit.
It links the body's
sozusagen,
nervous
das ist
system
im
to the
Gehirn,
endocrine system
der
through the
Hypothalamus,
pituitary
und da
gland.
angeschaltet die Hypophyse.
The pituitary gland is divided into two sections. The anterior portion produces two key hormones, LH and FSH. LH is responsible for stimulating the production of testosterone in the testes. FSH contributes to the production of sperm. These two hormones report back to the brain on whether the body is producing enough testosterone and sperm. The brain adjusts the amounts of each as necessary.
Wenn Sie Testosteron geben,
Testosterone
unterdrücken Sie die
replacement therapy
Hormone aus der
suppresses the hormones in the
Harnhausdrüse,
pituitary gland
die ja
that
auch
are
für die
responsible for sperm
Spermbildung
production.
zuständig sind.
It's like a birth
Testosteron
control
wirkt
pill.
also wie eine Pille für den Mann. Es unterdrückt die Spermienbildung. Wenn der Mann also
But if a
einen
man is
Kinderwunsch
testosterone deficient
und einen
and wants to have children,
Testosteronmangel hat,
we have to take a
müssen wir
different
anders
approach.
vorgehen.
Low testosterone can have serious effects on the body. But can too much of this hormone make men overly aggressive? This is Lyon, home of France's Centre for Cognitive Neurosciences. Jean-Claude Dreyer is a research director here. Dreyer has been studying the influence of testosterone on human behaviour, and he's found little evidence that testosterone stokes aggression in men.
The effect that testosterone has on human behavior is by no means clear, but there is some indirect evidence. For example, high levels of testosterone have been found in some prison inmates who have committed serious crimes. And we did a study which indicated that patients who are given testosterone injections could become more aggressive. But testosterone can also actually improve social behavior.
So at this point, there's little hard evidence pointing to a link between increased levels of testosterone and aggressive behaviour. Dreyer conducted an experiment to try to prove or disprove these claims. His first task was to measure the testosterone levels in the participants' blood. Testosterone is a fat-soluble hormone, so it can pass through the membranes of cells, bind with hormone receptors, and then produce changes in the cell's structure. Testosterone can be identified and measured in various bodily fluids, including saliva, urine, and blood. Before the experiment begins, one group of participants is injected with testosterone. The other group is given a placebo.
We tried to determine whether the increase in testosterone levels would contribute to a change in behavior. This graph shows that both groups started out with approximately the same level of testosterone. Then we gave one group testosterone injections and recorded the increase in the level of this hormone.
Now the test subjects are going to take part in a game exercise called Ultimatum. The game is frequently used in behaviour research. It's designed to test whether a person is generous or selfish. One of the players is given a sum of money and is required to share part of it with the other. If the second player accepts the offer, the deal goes ahead as planned, but if he rejects it, neither player gets any money.
At this point, we observed no difference between the player who'd been given testosterone and the one who hadn't.
Now the rules of the game are going to change a bit. The players will be able to use the money to reward fair behaviour or punish unfair behaviour. And this is where Dreyer and his colleagues observed a difference between the player who got an extra dose of testosterone and the one who didn't.
C'est un peu plus subtil. It's a subtle difference, and we confirmed it only in the second stage of the experiment. The group administered with extra testosterone imposed a more severe punishment when they believed that they hadn't been given enough money. But at the same time, they also reacted more positively when given more money than expected. We observed a big difference in the behavior of the two groups.
So, can testosterone also stimulate generosity in men? The researchers were surprised by the results, but the situation is more complex than that. Dreyer says there's a subconscious motivation at work here.
This phenomenon shows clearly that you can improve your social status if you cooperate with people or engage in other kinds of positive social behavior. So while testosterone can influence aggression, it also plays a role in the ability to act with generosity.
Dreyer has been looking for more evidence to support his theory on the influence of testosterone. So he's been studying brain activity.
Testosterone-based behavior can improve a man's social status, and that process could be linked to various mechanisms in the brain, particularly a group of neural structures known as the reward system.
Improved social status generates a sense of well-being, like a reward. That may explain the boasting trait commonly associated with excessive manly behavior.
There's always a motivation behind generosity. If someone sees you being generous, they're more likely to think highly of you. For example, men will probably be more generous if they know that they are being observed by women. This indicates another link between testosterone and generous behavior.
So testosterone may be responsible for positive and negative behaviour. In both cases, this behaviour seems to be directed at preserving or even improving social status. Psychologist Pranjal Mehta is an associate professor at University College in London. His research focuses on how hormones, particularly testosterone, influence human behaviour.
The evidence for that myth that testosterone is directly related to masculine traits like aggression has not borne out in the data. So there are plenty of results suggesting that testosterone is either weakly or unrelated to aggressive behavior at all in humans, including human males. So the field is still trying to unpack these kinds of effects to understand when testosterone might be related to other behaviors like helping and pro-social behavior as well.
Mehta has carried out an experiment that involves the ultimatum game, similar to the one we saw earlier.
It's actually a way to look at two kinds of behaviors. One is trust. To what extent is the first mover trusting? And two, to look at reciprocity of trust. If someone is hyper-trusting, is the second mover going to reciprocate that trust?
As in the experiment carried out by Jean-Claude Dreyer, one player was given an extra dose of testosterone. The other player was given a placebo. The experiment will measure the level of trust between the two. The player administered testosterone can use his money to make sure that the other player also profits. But will the second player give back some of his winnings as a gesture of gratitude? Or will he keep it all for himself?
We found two interesting effects. First is consistent with the stereotype, testosterone reduced trust in the first mover. So that is somewhat consistent with the stereotype of testosterone being related to competitiveness and threat in the environment, and maybe mobilizing more selfish social behaviors, right? So I want to keep the money.
Next, the players reverse their roles. both tests, the player with the extra testosterone shares his winnings with the other. This is an example of pro-social behaviour.
We know that reciprocity in cooperative situations is going to garner status. And what we found is that testosterone boosted reciprocity, and we're arguing that in a cooperative environment, it's through prestige and pro-social behaviors that you gain status. And so in those situations, testosterone actually might boost pro-social behavior.
Mehta is convinced that testosterone plays a much more complex role in human behaviour than researchers previously thought. For example, it can promote socially positive behaviour. But there's always a motivating factor behind that behaviour.
You can imagine when we think about our leaders and people in positions of power, they have expertise, knowledge, and experience that they're going to relay to their subordinates. That's part of being a good leader. That's also part of some definitions of power. Where you're helping others as a way to influence others in some way. So you could think of it as pro-social, but it's also, in some definitions, an exertion of power.
But concepts such as masculinity, status and power are perceived differently in various cultures around the world. Will the test results differ from one country to the next?
So if my laboratory is in London, someone else's laboratory is in Germany, someone else's laboratory is in a rural part of the south of the United States, that should theoretically be expected to change the results.
But the effects of testosterone on the human body are the same, regardless of culture and geography. When Christian Wulff found out that he was infertile, he started looking for solutions.
My mother took me to see a urologist, and he told her that I would never have children, but I could have a superlative sex life. My mom didn't think it was funny, so I started reading up on my condition.
Is there a medical solution to infertility caused by testosterone deficiency? Dr. Zitzmann offers some hope.
Wenn ein Mann einen Kinderwunsch hat und gleichzeitig einen
One of the things we can do for men who suffer from this problem is to give them injections of gonadotropin hormones.
Das wäre dann die richtige Therapie. Bei
This form of treatment has been used for years,
das ist schon seit
even
Jahren
decades.
oder Jahrzehnten bekannt.
The gonadotropins include LH, which is responsible for the production of testosterone in the testes, and FSH, which contributes to the production of sperm. The treatment was successful for Christian Wulff. His body was able to produce testosterone and fertile sperm for a short period of time. He had the sperm frozen for later use.
If I had listened to what the doctors told me at first, it would have ended right there. But now, I can have children.
Oliver Schultheis is a professor of psychology at Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen. His research work focuses on how testosterone affects the body, specifically bone growth.
Man kann diese lang andauernd wirksamen Effekte von Testosteron unter anderem
Testosterone and estradiol, its counterpart in females, contribute significantly to bone strength and density, from prenatal development to maturity. For example, during the first 3 months of pregnancy, testosterone causes the ring fingers of the male fetus to grow longer than the index fingers.
Schultheis notes that in general, women's index fingers are longer than their ring fingers. In men, it's just the opposite.
You can see that in this image of a man's hand. The index finger is clearly shorter than the ring finger.
Testosterone clearly has an influence on bone growth, even in the early stages of pregnancy. It may also be responsible for the early development of the so-called power motive.
As a
scientist, I'm interested in finding out where that motive comes from. I suspect that its origins can be found in biology.
Here, Schultheis is conducting an experiment in which the participants write a fantasy narrative. This may help him to determine whether they are motivated by power.
The power motive is a common human characteristic that involves one person's efforts to have an impact on the behavior of others. This motivation does not necessarily manifest itself in conscious attitudes or the beliefs that we have about ourselves. Our research indicates that the way we perceive ourselves actually has little to do with what makes us tick and what influences our spontaneous behavior.
This part of the experiment involves a series of 10 tests aimed at finding out how the participants respond to victory or defeat. The test results can be manipulated. One participant can win up to 8 of the 10 rounds. The researchers want to find out whether any changes take place in the test subjects' hormone levels.
We found that the power motive plays a role in their response to winning or losing. Those who won had higher levels of testosterone than those who lost.
And if one of the participants is not motivated by power, but wins, it has no effect on the amount of testosterone in his system.
We can't say that winning or losing is exclusively responsible for changes in testosterone levels. We have to take into account factors such as the individual's personality and motivation. But those factors are shaped by testosterone during fetal brain development.
But does it all come down to testosterone and its influence in determining, for example, male finger length and the development of the power motive? Women have only 10% of the testosterone levels found in men. Does that mean that they are less motivated by power?
There's evidence that indicates that there is a connection between the length of women's fingers and the power motive. It's a complex situation that will require a lot more research.
Scientists have learned more in recent years about female sex hormones, but the relationship between women and power has not been widely studied.
The field has focused on male reproductive system and males for the past 100 years and has largely neglected looking at female sex hormones in the context of status and leadership. And this is a large gap in the literature today.
We've come to the University of Cambridge to talk to clinical psychologist Simon Baron-Cohen. Part of his research focuses on how gender affects human behaviour in general and the brain in particular.
We've been looking at sex differences in the mind between males and females on average. And one of the tests that we use is where you have to find a shape that's hidden in a design as quickly as you can. And we find that on average, men are faster at finding this target hidden in the overall design.
Baron-Cohen and his colleagues conducted behavioural studies of children and adolescents. They started by testing hormone levels in numerous samples of amniotic fluid, the liquid that helps protect the fetus in the womb.
We've measured the testosterone during pregnancy in the womb, in the amniotic fluid. So this is the baby in the womb. And some women during pregnancy have a clinical procedure. It's called amniocentesis, where a needle goes into that fluid to take out some of the fluid. And we can measure testosterone in the fluid. And babies vary in terms of how much of the hormone they are exposed to. So boys show more testosterone than girls in the amniotic fluid.
In the early stages of fetal development, the genitalia show no signs of gender distinction. But after approximately the 7th week of gestation, a gene on the Y chromosome can activate a process that results in the development of testicles. Later, testosterone plays a role in the development of masculine characteristics in several parts of the male fetus, including the brain.
We're looking at these long-term effects of the hormones, presumably mediated by changes in brain development. So we're measuring the behavior, but the assumption is that the hormones have changed brain development in males and females because they're exposed to different amounts of the hormone.
After the babies in Baron Cohen's study were born, he measured and analysed their reaction to a series of images.
What we found was that the higher the child's prenatal testosterone, the less eye contact the child makes at their first birthday. So this was a surprise for us, because you would think eye contact is influenced by social factors, but actually it seems to also be influenced by prenatal testosterone.
The children were tested again at the age of 2. The results indicated that girls more actively sought eye contact than boys did and had better verbal skills.
They talk earlier and their language develops faster. What we didn't know is why. Why do girls have this advantage in language development? But now we could relate it back to the prenatal testosterone, because we found that children who had higher prenatal testosterone had smaller vocabularies.
Years later, Baron Cohen conducted more tests on the children. They were shown images of various facial expressions and were asked to describe the emotion the images portrayed.
And again, we found that the higher the child's prenatal testosterone, the more difficulty they have on this test of empathy, which is a surprise again for us, because we're finding there's, even though it's 8 years later since we measured the testosterone, there's still an effect that we're observing.
To sum up, girls did better on tests that involved verbal and social skills. Boys were better at developing analytical skills.
The same hormone seems to be involved not only in social development, like reading faces and language and eye contact, but also in non-social skills, like pattern recognition and taking things apart to see parts within holes, a bit like on the Rubik Cube, where you have to see the pattern very quickly.
The tests indicate that boys are better able to understand abstract concepts, but have less empathy. Baron Cohen has used the findings to support his theory of a possible link between testosterone and autism.
We looked at the relationship between typical sex differences and autism, because autism is more common in boys. So we were trying to understand why does being a boy lead you to a higher likelihood that you'll develop autism? And the answer we're getting is that one factor may be prenatal testosterone.
Research on this subject is still in the early stages, and experts are still trying to find out what role prenatal testosterone plays in determining sexual differentiation in the brain.
There's no evidence of predetermination in the brain. We're sort of pushed one way or the other by hormonal effects in the early stages of fetal brain development. But very much development happens later, after birth, in infancy, and beyond, when hormones act jointly with a number of external factors in the environment, and above all, in a child's social environment.
Pranjal Mehta has been researching the influence that hormones and social environment have on behaviour development.
Researchers have, including my lab, have looked at both directions of effects, how hormones influence dominance and status-related behaviors, and how one's social status and the environment, in turn, can impact hormone fluctuations in a feedback loop.
Mehta also studied how people perceive themselves and how that perception influences their behaviour. Do people consider themselves dominant or passive, and what role does testosterone play?
And so what we found was that testosterone didn't have a direct effect on competitive decision-making, but it really depended on whether they filled out the questionnaire suggesting that they were high or low in dominance. So some of our work does suggest that hormones do impact behaviors such as competitive behavior. But interestingly, and inconsistent with the sort of myth about testosterone's direct effect, this depends on people's personality, so the way we see ourselves.
So testosterone influences our personality, and in turn, our personality influences our level of testosterone. High levels of testosterone are said to make men virile and dominant, and society either views such men with respect or contempt. Testosterone also fuels competition among men. Perhaps it's no coincidence that this hormone was discovered during the late stages of the Industrial Revolution. In the 1850s, Charles-Édouard Brown-Séquard was one of the first scientists to speculate on the existence of substances that we now know as hormones. He also regularly injected himself with a fluid extracted from animal testicles and claimed that this process improved his sexual prowess and physical well-being. Testosterone has long been associated with masculinity, strength and vitality. Today, testosterone replacement therapy has become popular among older men. In some advertisements, it's touted as a miracle cure, much as Brown-Séquard claimed more than a century ago. Pharmacies, doctors and drug companies make a lot of money selling testosterone preparations. Sales have increased sharply since 2007. Dr. Michael Zitzman is regularly consulted by older men suffering symptoms of exhaustion. Many worry a testosterone deficiency may be the cause. Zitzman tests the patient's sperm count and bone density, among other procedures. In most cases, he's not able to attribute the symptoms to reduced levels of testosterone.
This
graphic shows the testosterone levels of 10,000 men ranging in age from 4 to 90. The boys, of course, have very low levels. The levels increase during puberty. Then we see high levels of testosterone right into old age.
If we rule out disease, there are several reasons why testosterone levels may fall.
In the vast majority of cases, these patients produce less testosterone simply because they're overweight. Obesity is a problem for many older men, and younger men too, for that matter. Overweight men usually have a lot of visceral fat, and that fat releases a number of harmful substances. And it can lead to insulin resistance, high blood pressure, and lower testosterone levels.
One layer of body fat lies just beneath the skin. A second layer, visceral fat, is stored in the abdominal cavity near several vital organs. Excess visceral fat can cut testosterone production, which can promote the storage of even more fat in the abdominal cavity. This causes the spare tire that's common among middle-aged men. Testosterone is often associated with doping scandals in competitive sports. Michael Kleber, with the German Olympic Sports Confederation, is an expert on the use of performance-enhancing substances, including testosterone.
Testosteron geht damit einher, dass man eine
Testosterone plays a
bessere
key role in
Regeneration
regulating muscle
bei
mass and how the body
Muskelaufbautraining
responds to
letztendlich hat.
exercise.
Das heißt, im
During
Trainingsprozess
prolonged
zertrümmert
physical
man ja seine
activity, the muscles
Muskelfasern ein
suffer
Stück weit
minor
und
trauma.
setzt so den Anreiz,
So
dass der
afterward, the
Muskel
body
sich
starts
wieder
repairing the
aufbaut.
damaged
Und für diese
muscular tissue
ganzen
and increasing
Prozesse, die
its
im Körper
strength and
ablaufen,
size.
ist Testosteron gewissermaßen der Schlüsselstoff.
Until recently, only professional athletes used performance-enhancing drugs. Now, amateur athletes are taking them as well.
Insbesondere der Gebrauch von
The use of testosterone derivatives, called anabolic steroids at commercial fitness studios, is a huge problem right now. We believe that 13 to 16% of all clients have used doping preparations, mostly anabolic steroids. It's a lot more widespread among amateur athletes than it is among the professionals.
Dieses Problemfeld ein deutlich größeres ist als das im Hochleistungssport.
Healthy males produce 4 to 8 milligrams of testosterone every day. But for those who are trying to increase muscle mass and performance, that amount is too little. Christian Wolf tried using testosterone supplements to counter his hormone deficiency.
Es gibt zum Beispiel solche Produkte in der Supplementindustrie, die nennen sich
testosterone boosters in capsule
sollen sie
form.
dabei helfen, das Testosteron zu erhöhen.
I knew that they
sind
weren't
jetzt keine
going to
Arzneimittel,
work,
sondern sind einfach
but I tried them
Kapseln,
anyway.
Und die sind halt völliger
companies
Blödsinn.
that make
Das wusste ich
these
auch vorher
products
schon,
play
aber
on
in der
your
Situation
emotions.
greift man natürlich trotzdem und denkt sich,
That's why I
vielleicht
bought
doch
them.
irgendwie.
And of course,
wird mit der Emotion
they
gespielt,
didn't
habe ich
help
auch
at all.
gekauft, hat natürlich nichts gebracht.
But only anabolic steroids, synthetic versions of testosterone, can produce the kinds of results that the athletes want. The use of steroids to enhance performance is widespread among bodybuilders.
Aus meinen eigenen Forschungsarbeiten habe ich noch ein konkretes
In my own
Beispiel
research,
eines
I came across the
17-jährigen
case of a
User,
17-year-old who was using these
das zeigt,
substances.
dass pro Woche weit mehr als 1000 Milligramm Testosteron
It was scary. He was injecting more than 1,000 milligrams of testosterone derivatives a week. He was also taking dianabol steroid tablets every day. So in all, that's a lot more than 1,000 milligrams a week. That's a dangerous amount for a 17-year-old.
Das ist für einen jungen Mann mit 17 Jahren überaus erschreckend.
The abuse of anabolic steroids can have a number of dangerous side effects, including high blood pressure, strokes, heart attacks, and liver damage. Excessive increases in testosterone can lead to reductions in sperm production, because the brain determines that the body has enough testosterone and cuts off the supply. Pranjal Mehta has been studying whether substances besides testosterone can influence human behaviour. For example, cortisol, a hormone that's often released in response to stress and low concentrations of blood sugar.
There was some evidence that cortisol levels could impact the pathway between testosterone and behavioral outcomes. Specifically, hormones don't influence behavior directly, but there's a mechanism through which they occur. Specifically, one mechanism is they bind to a receptor for that specific hormone. In the case of testosterone, that would be the androgen receptor.
This binding process takes place throughout the body, like a key fitting into a lock. Mehta believes that in stressful situations, cortisol blocks the testosterone receptors.
If cortisol levels are high, that could actually antagonize or impede the relationship between testosterone and behavior, presumably through molecular pathways such as receptor reduction. And so we theorized what we call the dual hormone hypothesis.
This role-playing exercise is designed to test the effect of cortisol on testosterone. One participant gives a series of orders to the other. If the player who's supposed to follow the orders feels stressed, his behaviour changes.
We found that when levels of cortisol were low, that effect occurred, that higher testosterone was related to more dominance. But when cortisol levels are high, that effect wasn't there. Higher testosterone was not related to more dominance. So this is suggesting that testosterone's effects on dominant behavior in a position of leadership really depends on what's happening in the stress axis in the body.
So is it possible that testosterone is just one of many substances that can influence human behavior? More research on this subject needs to be done. At this point, experts have come to a variety of different conclusions.
Biology does not mean simplicity. I think it's recognizing and appreciating the complexity that we are human beings, we're dynamic systems, we've developed and evolved to adapt to different environments, and that hormones actually, their beauty again is that they are responsive to the environment. So your hormones affect the way you behave, but then the environment also affects your hormone release.
In general, testosterone represents two of the major societal themes of our time: competition and success. The cliché is that men who have too little testosterone are losers. Men who have a lot of it are winners.
I
don't know whether I should be proud of how much testosterone I have or not. It depends on what society thinks are desirable qualities in men. And that concept can change depending on the culture and the era.
Testosterone is the stuff that men are made of. The actual quantity is not so important, but every man needs at least a minimum amount.
Since I started testosterone replacement therapy, I've felt a lot better. The depression and lack of energy disappeared in 2 weeks, and things just kept getting better for me. I'm not confused and unhappy anymore.
So there's no simple one-to-one link between testosterone and male aggression or quest for power. Latest findings indicate it's social and cultural environment factors that determine testosterone's effects on manly behaviour.